that's theirs. There's kind of a timeline, there on the ground floor there, and when kind of Mennonite arrival here to this part of the country, from Russia and stuff. I was looking at that timeline. I was like, this is how the Mennonites became white. This is what this is. It kind of marks it out. Of being kind of recognized. By government, given certain plots of land at, kind of bargain basement prices that had been, taken from others, and given the goodies, that were associated with this. But this is just say that, this is a process. This becoming white and the development of this category and the legal structures that surround it were a historical process. It's more complicated than we can maybe get into here with much time, but this is what has emerged. And so there is this sort of conscription that goes on with whiteness, and Mennonites hate conscription, right? I mean, this is this is something to be resisted. So I assume I have a captive audience here for this proposal here. Whiteness is it's a category that kind of one is deemed to be white, or whenever we're talking about race, we're talking about perceptions of race. I mean, this is not a the geneticists will tell us that there's no kind of biological basis for race per se, but it is a social reality, so there's conscription going on here that folks with certain phenotypes and certain melanin levels are kind of conscripted into this category, and I sometimes hear folks who self-identify as white or who are identified as white. Well, my family didn't have slaves, and we got here after all that, and what are you talking about? And I say, well, but you picked up the baton, and then you ran the next leg of the race with it, and that baton was kind of, stolen property, basically, got reinvested pretty well. So this is, something to think about here. So what gets left for white folk is often a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, is there any positive content in being, of European descent? And these are the sorts of conversations that go on. But this conscription that goes on, a lot of it has the negative effect of truncating a sense of humanity. That is, to identify with being white. Because this is a category that was made in order to kind of divvy up resources in an unequal distribution, it has the way of constricting one's notion of what is human, or whose lives matter, right? That is, where loyalties lie, where empathy is. It truncates empathy. And just, some examples of this are the sort of settler colonialism narratives that are built into everyday life that become sort of just the infrastructure of life. And this is something that I'm really glad to see that Mennonite Central Committee has this new curriculum, the Doctrine of Discovery curriculum, and I know, a lot of you are looking at that in your congregations, and this, seems like some really good resources that they put together, to look at this history and how some of these attitudes came about. And so these settler colonial narratives are so naturalized as to make whiteness a sort of default category, that often goes unmentioned. And so then we have situations here where we're living in Cheyenne Bottoms, in subdivisions named Shawnee Mission, and you can buy Dutch colonial houses, or ranch style, or Cape Cod. So there's this overlaying of European architecture on seized native lands, So just the entire logic of the spaces that are inhabited have already themselves been inscribed by white supremacy. So it's no wonder that this would be so pervasive. And so this, with these being the assumed narratives that are there and not being questioned, This is the cause of a lot of shame and guilt that some white folks have that is frankly not very helpful to the situation. I don't want your guilt. I don't want to have to deal with that. Any therapist worth their salt will tell you that you have a lot of guilt. You just really can't move on in your life if you have guilt, and that's true socially too. So get over that, or don't talk to me about it. Go and talk to, unless you're giving me a copay. This is something like that. But there are spaces and organizations actually, that where you can talk about some of those things, and that's important. And now I'm speaking specifically to folks that are self-identify as white. That there's spaces where you can do that. But what might the alternatives be to these sort of settler colonialist or white supremacist narratives of being, of identifying? What would it look like to not buy into this stuff for white people? So I put together a little slideshow here that I like to call White Accomplices. There's actually a website out there. It's a fabulous website called whiteaccomplices.org. Everybody go look at it. It's great. It has some great tips on it for how to throw a monkey wrench in this whole thing called white supremacy, and what, especially, those folks out there who are perceived to be white, let's put it that way, because there's this aspect of being white presenting, how to use that sort of privilege in a manner which undermines white supremacy. Because part of the conscription aspect of whiteness is that there is just a presumption that by appearance that one would be in league, with these sorts of white supremacist attitudes and assumptions and stuff. So any way that you can take to kind of undermine that, in a way, it throws a monkey wrench in it. It can't function. It only functions with collusion. So once enough people, and it only takes just a small percentage of people to not cooperate with the system for it to fall. It just, it really it doesn't take that many people. This is, been true of a lot of places, a lot of things. So stop colluding. And here's some things here's some examples of some folks that have done some things, that to use white privilege, not to be a white savior, not to ride in on a white horse, haha, but to join in with a struggle already in progress that people of color have been fighting for centuries, and to ally, to be an accomplice with, because an ally is kind of a nice thing. An ally kind of pats you on the back and says, you're doing a great job and all this, but I want an accomplice, to fight against white supremacy. I want someone that has skin in the game. It's kind of conspiratorial too, to be an accomplice, which makes it kind of fun, because especially if nobody's suspecting that this innocent-looking white woman over here would have these opinions, and then you just zing, and it's kind of can work your street cred up a little bit. It can be fun here too. So here's some examples of some folks who took things a different direction. I'm calling it Huck Finn narratives. So, y'all remember Huck Finn? Yeah? So the highlight of the book, so, Huck, has kind of run away from his aunt, and, Jim's a runaway slave, and they're on the raft together, on the river. That is, they're not on dry land, right? Which is, defined by all those structures and legalities and systems. They're together on this boat together, kind of escaping together. And Jim's he's an escaped slave, and there's a bounty out on his head, and they, Huck and Jim go through a lot together while they're traveling together, both, kind of running from their own respective problems. And there comes a time, Huck knows that Jim he's a wanted man. There's wanted posters out, and he knows, Huck knows, he's been taught by his aunt, he's gone to Sunday school, and he's supposed to follow the law, he's supposed to be a good Christian, and he knows he should hand Jim in to the authorities. That's what's required of him, to be a good boy and turn Jim in. You know. And yet Jim has been so good to him, and they've forged a friendship, a bond, you know, while they've been on the lam together on this boat, you know. So Huck is really, he's really having to think hard about this, and it's very, you know, it's difficult for him, and he prays about it, you know, one night. You know, it's like, what am I going to do? Am I supposed to turn Jim in or not? And he's just like, well. And then finally he decides that he can't do it. He can't turn Jim in. You know, that is, he's casting his lot with Jim, saying, I'm going to be with Jim. You know, and he knows that that's wrong. You know, but he says, well, I guess I'll just go to hell then. You know? So, I mean, which is to say that Huck knows there's going to be hell to pay for allying with this black man who's on the lam, this escaped slave, you know. But he does it anyway. Besides, that's where his loyalty is going to be. You know, this is one of the classics of American literature for a reason, you know, to really ruminate on this issue. So what I take from that is that hell, you know, when some white person decides to ally themselves with the struggle of people of color, hell is going to result. You know, your version of hell may differ by time and place, but there will be consequences. You know, it's not going to be pleasant. So just kind of, you know, if you're down for this journey, then just kind of give up on the narrative, which is actually, it's a white narrative. It's presented as neutral, you know, that life is going to be easy, or that, you know, things are going to be comfortable. And, you know, people of color are uncomfortable pretty much every day, you know, have to kind of move through a society that was not constructed for our benefit, you know. So come on over and, you know, come join us, and, you know, and prepare to be uncomfortable. You'll find actually a lot of company, and I think you'll, you know, it'll be enriching, and it'll be morally rewarding as well. So this you know, hell, which may vary by time, location, and intensity, is you know, kind of in direct proportion to kind of acting with moral agency. That is, you know, as I've said before, part of what this category of whiteness does is because it's a negation. It's a not Indian, it's a not black, it's a not Asian, it's a not, and so it's inherently unstable. You know, because, you know, legally, you know, the work that this was doing, because, you know, these racial categories are doing actual work, you know, but it's unstable too. So it needs constant propping up, you know, and so that's the kind of propping up like we saw last summer in Charlottesville. That's what that was about. It's propping it up, you know. It's very unstable. You start pulling on this, and, you know, it brings out a lot of hate. But part of what's going on there is this shrinking of the empathy that's happened. But what can happen with moral agency is the expansion of empathy, is that Huck Finn option of saying that, yes, I'm casting my lot with a broader group of people, you know, in the fight for justice and advocacy. So here's just an example of Samuel Worcester. I believe he's from Massachusetts originally. But he was a minister, actually, to the Cherokee Nation in Georgia. And this was at a time when President Jackson, was working on the Indian removal project, you know, what came to be known as the Trail of Tears. There had been, of course, prior treaties that had been struck between different indigenous nations and the United States government, which were being violated by these actions to take over Indian land. And so one of the court cases that was lodged on behalf of the Cherokee was this Worcester v. Georgia case before the Supreme Court. And it's importantly, they won. The Cherokee Nation won their case. But Jackson, and there's a picture of Jackson now that's in the Oval Office. That's been this president's kind of model president there, you know. So the Cherokee Nation won their case. That is, they won the right to remain on their ancestral lands, as had already been the agreed upon treaty with the United States government. Basically, the Supreme Court was saying, yes, the United States government needs to recognize its own treaty. Period, the end, you know. But Jackson said, well, you know, justices don't have an army. That is, he defied the rule of law. You know, so this is one of the many kind of instances of contingency in our history where things could have been much differently, you know, had Jackson just followed the rule of law. You know, this is, you know, just, you know, not that long after judicial review was established, you know, but here it is. Here he's, you know, defying it. So, so Worcester was in jail for quite a long time for doing this. And he ended up going to Indian Territory there, what's now known as Oklahoma, where he died. You know, there. So this, you know, hell, he's in jail, Trail of Tears, and he dies in exile. You know, so part of the white folks who make the Huck Finn option is that the high price of social rejection, you know. You'll be the skunk at the garden party. You'll be unfriended on Facebook. You'll ruin Thanksgiving dinner, this sort of thing. So here's, you know, an early example here. These sisters who are, you know, the daughters of some slaveholders. They're from South Carolina, who themselves became abolitionists, you know, and traveled all over in writing and tried to appeal as white Christian women to other white Christian women in the South, saying, you know, that this slavery system is something, it needs to end, you know. So they left behind, you know, quite a bit of family wealth, which would have been theirs in the form of a dowry, had they done the right thing and, you know, kind of just kept their mouth shut and gotten married and, you know, all this sort of thing. But they didn't. You know, this is the option they took, and they, you know, never lived down south again. You know, they were rejected by their families. But this is, you know, these are the folks that I think, you know, the long durée of history sees as the moral exemplars, I should hope, you know. They had lots of other sisters and brothers that, you know, did not take these positions. We don't know about them, you know. These, to me, are the more morally compelling individuals, you know, from their family, and, you know, worthy of emulation. Abolitionists in Massachusetts railway station. You know, there was a lot of argument about, you know, in the lead up to the Civil War about states' rights, and then, you know, of course, in the kind of ex post facto explanations for the causes of the war about, you know, states' rights. But the truth was that when northern states attempted to assert states' rights by not complying with the fugitive slave law, you know, this is when they were getting quashed. So it's states' rights for whom, right? Maybe it seems that, you know, the only states' rights states who thought their rights were worthy of being protected and their interests being protected were these, you know, Southern Confederate states. But there were a lot of northern states in the Union that were trying to assert their right to not comply with the fugitive slave law, which impelled northerners to basically deputize any white person. Again, there's this kind of collusion and conscription aspect to commandeer escaped slaves and return them back to their masters or to the bounty hunters that came after them. So, you know, so here's a family that is defying that, you know. And, you know, again, with some, you know, these were people that were seen as zealots. You know, you go back and look at some of those, you know, abolitionists, you know, back in the day, they were, you know, I mean, admired in some circles, yes, but, you know, but also kind of, you know, seen as, you know, people who were just a little bit, you know, waving their hands in the air and this a little apocalyptic and this sort of thing. So that's another That's another characterization that you can expect if you choose to make the Huck Finn option. Right? In my own Virginia, there was a man who made, an option to assist runaway slaves by, infiltrating. I mean, he was himself the son of slaveholders, and he infiltrated communities, right, in order to collect intelligence, because there were, bounty hunters that had approached, and so then he knew where to keep, where to assist escapees, to stay away from certain areas and this sort of thing, or when the bounty hunter party, planned to leave the area, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, he was despised, disowned by his family and community, of course, and never really found him. There were, some reports of him around 1861 of being, in the area, but then the trail just kind of goes off. We don't know what happened, but he's presumed dead. Of course, John Brown, I was pleased to learn yesterday that there's a Wichita brewing company that has this image on their logo, I guess, of John Brown here. So this, very famous example, of course, of John Brown's march on Harper's Ferry, and of course he was captured and executed. John Brown's campaign has had, quite an afterlife in terms of being an inspiration, certainly for Union soldiers who the song that we now know as the Battle Hymn of the Republic was originally sung to John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. I mean, this was the kind of Union soldiers marching song sort of thing. So here we have someone, another kind of abolitionist individual from Massachusetts, who again was, not, it was seen as unladylike, what she was advocating, and her sorts of activities, again, were, kind of put her at some remove from more respectable elements of her family. And here she has, in this hymn, Battle Hymn of the Republic, it's originally, that these lyrics are originally for Union soldiers as they are marching south. It's now been adopted by the United States military and sung, in many different settings. But it's a very, militant statement about whose side God is on, right? As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. I mean, this is a very militant statement, and understanding of the Union cause, which is not very popular in the town where I grew up, or where I, am now. No, yeah. Have you ever seen the film The Free State of Jones? This is the individual was the topic of that film. There were within the South, and this is the history that's been written out of so many of, at least of Southern renditions of U.S. history during the Civil War, is that there were Unionists in the South. I mean, we know, there were, families were split on the issue. One brother went for the Union, the other for the Confederacy, this sort of thing. But there were significant kind of pockets too of Unionist sentiment within the South, including. In Mississippi here, which Mississippi, along with South Carolina, I think both states, I believe, had over 50% of the population at the time of the Civil War was enslaved. So these are just huge land holdings, and huge. They're forced labor camps. I mean, call them what they are. The plantations kind of has such a nice ring to it, but they're forced labor camps. That's what it was. So here's someone who was a Unionist, and again was shunned after the war, by society, and the kind of recrimination, kind of curdling, which took place, among some white Southerners, especially in high slaveholding districts such as this, in Mississippi. And so he kind of, withdrew from society. It was just him and his common law wife. Couldn't get married. It's not even legal, right? I mean, again, people that are in supposedly separate legal racial categories could not legally be married until 1967, right? So anyway, he's, has his own life, after the war, with his family, but withdrawn from the otherwise white supremacist order that surrounds them, that he had fought against. North Carolina, where I lived for a while, the portrayal, often the portrayal of the Reconstruction era, that is the post-Civil War era, from 1865 to 1877, was given let's put it this way, the lost cause narrative of white Southerners won that battle in terms of how Reconstruction was portrayed in history books for many, many years. It's only been in the past generation or two generations of historians, the past 40 years or so, that there's been a wholesale positive reconsideration of what Reconstruction did, which was a 12-year period from the end of the Civil War in 1865 till the withdrawal of Union troops in 1877, a 12-year period of hopeful multiracial democracy. That's what was happening. Former slaves and other folks getting elected to state legislatures, becoming even, sometimes congressional representatives in Washington, and just a window of possibility of what could have been with these Republican legislators, and with the kind of holding at bay, former Confederate officers could not run for office, right? And so there was the kind of post-war creation of new state governments. Like in my own state of Virginia, this is how we got public education, finally, was during Reconstruction, because the landed gentry, which always ran the show there, white folks, never really wanted public education and didn't, so this is something that, and this demonstrates something that, like, black folks are the tide that lifts all boats. So when, kind of, former slaves are coming, and getting with the Freedmen's Bureau and others, and trying to implement public education, it's also benefiting poor white folks too, in finally getting public education established. So here's here's someone who's denounced as a scalawag and for having the temerity to join forces with former enslaved folks and to stave off, trying to stave off the reimposition of white supremacist rule. Of course, ultimately there was, kind of a deal that got cut, and Union troops withdrew in 1877. But then this individual here, Phillips, was, kind of carried on with his justice commitments in representing Homer Plessy in the Plessy v. Ferguson case. So this is the case where it's actually a mixed race man tries to get on the first class train in Louisiana and is rebuffed, and this is what establishes separate but equal doctrine. So he was Phillips was Homer Plessy's attorney, and again, socially ostracized. Eleanor Roosevelt, she landed on her feet. Wasn't too. She was socially ostracized in some circles, but did very well. But here is someone who, she, really stood up to kind of her own, kind of the parameters of social class, into which she was born as a daughter of the American Revolution, and just said, I'm not going to associate with an organization that would, prohibit Marian Anderson from singing, at the Constitution Hall, So this, there's quite a correspondence going back and forth between the president of the DAR and Eleanor Roosevelt about this, an unfortunate incident in the words of the president. But she was pretty resolute that, that this is not an organization I want to be associated with. In our own Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, there was a woman by the name of Sarah Paton Boyle, who was very herself kind of had a moment of, or she changed her mind, let's put it that way, on issues of racial integration, and was pretty much alone among her social cohort there in supporting racial integration of the schools and standing against the town's efforts to prohibit racial integration. So Charlottesville was one of 3 communities in the Commonwealth of Virginia that, after the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education, of course, Brown from the Topeka, right, that segregation case, which mandated the integration of schools. So Charlottesville was one of 3 communities in Virginia that shut down its schools for 2 or 3 years rather than integrate them. I mean, that's how, baked into the DNA of Charlottesville, white supremacy is, there was one of, only 3 communities that actually shut down the schools for several years. So there are a number of, and then what happened was that a number of the kind of downtown high-status white churches opened up segregation, what we call segregation academies, in their basements, basically so that the white children could continue going to school and were educated without interruption, while meanwhile black children had no education for several years. So anyway, so this brave lady stood up to this and encouraged some of her white cohorts to rather to support integration, and this is how she was rewarded for it. So she got crosses burned on her lawn, and actually the cross there that she's holding in her hand is now in the archives at the University of Virginia. It's on display now. It's as part of objects for the history of the university. We're entering our 200th year next year, and this is one of the objects, that's very just kind of seminal to our history. But she was, again, a lot of social rejection, just, another Virginian is Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, from Northern Virginia, from a wealthy family of former slaveholders, and this is her in the middle there. She kind of has the she'd gone to down south, further south, to do sit-ins and to be in solidarity in the civil rights movement, and so was abused with the other folks that were there too. But anyway, she's now she's one of the citizens of the Commonwealth of Virginia that is very much admired. But at the time, this is what was going on. Yeah, and I always wonder, who are these people? The guys, pouring the sugar and the ketchup and and all this. They're probably still alive too. And notice there's a lot more of them. And this is what I wonder in part when I look at sometimes at the lynching photos too. You see the lynching parties that are there, and there's just a crowd of people that are just participating in this spectacle and stuff. Who are these people? What happened to them? Where did they go? I mean, the folks that pouring that, they probably became, some of them probably became the mayor, and some of them probably a teacher at the school, and I mean, this is the normal social fabric here, so it's it's a very small group of folks who will actually stand up to this. She did. Another, you can tell that I sometimes give this presentation to folks around UVA. This is an older professor, now retired, who was involved in the civil rights movement, got beat up for it in Charlottesville. yeah, he had invited MLK to come and speak, and he was, this professor was, again, kind of in these white people who have opted to cast their lot with, to struggle with, to be an accomplice with, people of color. And, in this case, his version of hell was getting beat up in his own town, by, the same kind of people that were beating up on Joan Trumpauer here, were beating up on him in the restaurant in Charlottesville there. And then, of course, in one of the worst cases, that of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. And this was the case that really galvanized and finally, got into passage the Voting Rights Act. This was Freedom Summer in the South. If you've ever seen the movie Mississippi Burning, it's a fairly inaccurate portrayal of all this, where the FBI is, of course, the heroes. But anyway, these are the events of that summer, with lots of volunteers coming down from the north. Again, not coming in as saviors, but rather joining forces with black folks that were already, engaged in the struggle and organizing the struggle to register folks to vote in the South. And this is what the fate that befell them. They were arrested on trumped up charges and brought into town and jailed. And in the meantime, we can only imagine a kind of rabble-rousing Klansmen were called up, and then the police let them go and kind of followed them out of town, and they basically released them into the hands of the Klan, and then they were killed. Interestingly, was Schwerner, I believe Cheney too. They were both Jewish and from New York City, and their parents actually wanted them. I think Schwerner's parents, I believe it was, wanted their son to be buried along with Cheney, with the local black man there. He said that they were brothers in life, that this is where they should be buried, but by law at that time, black people and white people couldn't be, buried together, notwithstanding the desire of the parents to do that with their son's remains. I like this kind of saints, martyrs of the civil rights movement, because a saint is well, a martyr of course is someone who dies for the cause, and a saint is someone whose sanctity in life is deemed worthy of being followed, by those of us who survive. So, there you can see their burnt car at the bottom. Another, this is a reverend, another one beaten to death. This is the precursor to the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Rabbi Heschel, who I first read when I was here at Bethel, when I was studying with Dwayne Friesen, was a kind of mystical rabbi, mid-20th century, and his congregation, his Jewish congregation, did not appreciate the fact that he was getting his name in the paper, he's out in the streets, and this. I mean, again, this is the kind of social cost that there is, I mean, in the case of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, I mean, that version of hell was, pretty hellacious. They died, This was kind of more professional discomfort, by his congregants, who are paying his salary too. So this is the part of the cost, Another one, woman, Viola Liuzzo, who came down south to organize, was killed. She herself was from an Italian-American family, and if you know anything about the history of European immigration to this country, was one of yet another group. I mean, Italians, Jews, Poles, Germans, Irish, were not considered white, you know. They were rather kind of probationary whites, whites with an asterisk, as it were. If they would behave themselves and collude, basically, pick up that baton and keep running with it, then they could get the goodies, things like great mortgage rates and, right, free land or reduced price land, this sort of thing. So she was from an Italian-American family, and, she was, they were, not, they were poor themselves, but notice that they were treated better than the black folks around her. Another martyr. There's now a feast day in the Episcopal Church of the United States that celebrates his martyrdom. So it's recognized with liturgies every year to kind of put him in the liturgical calendar of remembrance of the church, which is something very important to do, I think. Yeah? Here's someone who recently opened the Whitney Plantation outside New Orleans. Again, this is someone who he could have started a chic bed and breakfast, but opted rather to do something different. Apparently, this is this is opened up a couple of years ago, and it's quite well done from the accounts I've read. But apparently, when people, particularly white folks, came, they expected a plantation tour of the sort that you would normally have around there, which basically takes one, into their very opulent settings, and says nothing about the hundreds or so people that actually worked in the forced labor camp around it that supported the opulence in the main house. So in this case, one approaches through the slave quarters, which have been restored, and you only enter the house through the back door. So in other words, the perspective of visiting this museum deliberately undermines the kind of presumed neutrality of whiteness that would be, entering through the front door. Well, the vast majority of people who lived on this forced labor camp would not have entered through the front door, would they have? No. Well, they wouldn't have entered at all, and the ones that would have entered through the back door. So it's a deliberate shifting away from this narrative of whiteness and this kind of presumed naturalness of that in order to take visitors, into these quarters. I was just at Georgetown a few days ago, where they are struggling with their own legacy of selling enslaved human beings in order to bolster their coffers, right? And figuring out what is the obligation of the university to the descendants of these folks. So, here's an alum that they funded a project to do the research to actually find all the living descendants of them, and they're finding more and more with each week that goes on, and saying, if the descendants of white donors are giving preferential option for admission, right? And the legacies, those whose folks and grandfolks and, went to the university, why should not the descendants of the folks who, be, yes, I think so. Yeah, that's what Georgetown's saying, that this needs to happen. Kind of more up to the present day. There's been this part of what's happened during the presidential campaign in 2016, which we really experienced in our town, was that there was this whipping up of white supremacist sentiment, that it was okay again. It was okay to be a racist again, kind of, or what Trump derided as political correctness is what I call human decency. That it became acceptable, or it was normalized, for these sorts of white supremacist sentiments to be, you know, openly trumpeted in public. And you know, here's some folks saying no, you know, that to not collude with it. Now we know, you know, from the results of the election that the majority of white voters voted for Trump. You know, and sometimes kind of cast as this, you know, this is kind of a downwardly mobile, you know, frustrated working class white folks that voted, but it was also you know, among college educated folks too, white folks too. It was not just can't just be kind of pointing to as sort of class anxiety. That is to say that this sort of racist comments that Trump made during the campaign were not seen as disqualifying, apparently, you know, for these voters, you know. So, standing up. In my own university there at the University of Virginia, I was across the street while this was happening, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow morning, but I was across the street in the church while the Nazis came and surrounded this statue of Thomas Jefferson and then threatened and assaulted the kids that were there, that sort of thing. So after the Nazis dispersed, the police threatened these kids with arrest. You know, it's just inexplicable. But anyway, so yeah, this is your version of hell may vary. I mean, they were assaulted. You know, one guy, he was clocked so hard with one of those tiki torches that he had a stroke, and there's other, you know, I had one of my former students was there. She was in a wheelchair, you know, and there was, you know, no getting away. And so the costs of standing up to white supremacy and to kind of, you know, saying no, resisting dissent, are high. And it's not going to be comfortable because white supremacy has made things very comfortable for white people. So by definition, challenging it is going to make things uncomfortable. You know, so just adjust yourself to that reality, and then everything will be fine. Yeah. This is one of our more recent martyrs from our town in Charlottesville. And she, you know, she was just came to stand up, you know, that day, and you know, very young woman. Yeah, and if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. So that, you know, that's, you know, a great reminder to kind of take and to be attentive to where resistance can be lodged, you know, to this system, you know, to not allow it to commandeer public spaces, to commandeer public discourse in ways that are unchallenged. It must always be challenged, but challenging it does carry costs. You know, in this case, you know, she's no longer with us, you know. But part of what this has to do is to challenge peers, you know. There's some great T-shirts that have this phrase on it that are really fun to wear. That I have white friends. I do have white friends, I'm going to say, and some of them have T-shirts which say this. So just you know, some kind of pointers like how to take white privilege, how to do the Huck Finn option, how to not collude, but rather reject and resist, you know. In order, there's like I said, there's a great website, whiteaccomplices.org, you know, which has some handy tips, you know, very, very well done. Just you know, there's, I mean, the kind of more a lot of how white supremacy operates is institutionalized, of course. You know, it's not as obvious as Nazis marching in your street, you know. I mean, that to a lot of people, you know, seems really obvious that, you know, you need to reject this. Unfortunately, our town officials did not feel that way, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow. But to fight institutionalized white supremacy, this requires more, because it requires showing up. You know, it's not enough to just, you know, make a comment on a Facebook page. Yeah, but actually being involved and being attentive to where decisions are being made that are more about that kind of passing the baton, that white supremacist baton along, and advancing it, and how to interrupt that, But that takes showing up. It doesn't just happen on its own. Some white folks ask, what can I do? And, one of the best things you can do to use your white privilege is to cop watch. You see what all is happening. You see what happened at Starbucks in Philly? This is, ridiculous, But we only know about that because some white lady was filming it and put that out there, and it went viral. You know what I mean? So cop watch, folks. It's like, you might save some black person's life. And it's hard to talk to white people about this because they assume that that all the policemen are nice and it's just a couple of bad apples out there, but the apple barrel is toxic. So you got to watch the cops. It is legal to record the police. Do not let them tell you otherwise. They try to do that. They try to take your camera. They try to, but it's legal. As long as you're not impeding someone's duty. If you're standing in a public place, you're filming a public official conducting their public duties, it is not illegal. So do it. You're not likely to suffer much. Well, your version of hell may vary. I have a friend who does this, a white friend, who's been hassled, by the cops after that. They pull her over for, petty and sundry perceived offenses, and then she has to go waste her time going to court and paying fines, and so this, that'll happen. There's hell. There, may vary, but that's a pretty low bar, I'd say. So think about it. Cop watch. There are, other things too, that we'd expect any person of goodwill to kind of offer public critiques, and just throw the monkey wrench in there. Just do not collude. Resist. All right. Open to you.
Thank you so much. We are going to open it up for some questions right now for Dr. Schmidt. So I will run up. If you have a question, raise your hand.
Question or comment. Thank you for your words and the research that led to them. I was, in your early words, surprised, not reminded, because I didn't remember it, of the attitude of Benjamin Franklin. The Germans invited to Pennsylvania by Penn preceded him by 100 years. So he was that far behind?
I don't know what his issue was, but he was just sure that the Germans were just a kind of swarthy, tawny. So here's the racialization already, coming in, just in the characterization of them, and that they were just going to bring down America. They were not assimilable. This is the argument that's made about each successive wave of immigrants coming in. But it's often forgotten that, the Germans, Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles, etc., were all kind of cast in this way. Yeah.
I'm going to take a shortcut.
Yeah.
Knew this would happen.
Just coming over.
Oh, y'all are making me work out, man.
Finally. So, racial categories keep evolving, but they seem to be getting harder in this country, and we seem to be living in a big sort of structural contradiction where the official laws are contrary to racial separation, but the census categories keep being reinforced and used and applied. So how do we get out of this contradiction where the more we protest racial categorization, it's seemingly the harder the categories get and the categories get used to protest the categories. So it seems as if we're stuck in a vocabulary that is self-defeating. Maybe you don't agree, but I mean, how do we achieve non-racial societal sort of reality?
Well, I mean, the problem, of course, is the kind of centuries of accrual, with these categories and how this has divvied out the resources, and so that there, some arguments like, well, we should just be colorblind, we just need to get over this, and but the problem, of course, is that the historical reality has definitely tipped the scale, pretty heavily, and so to recognize that, and the injustices that have accumulated there is very important, and I think some of this reckoning with history, or at least kind of what I'm seeing, at least in my town, in my setting, what we're doing is to kind of recognizing the past, is to kind of uncovering and facing the past in a way that's honest. And there are some kind of local, kind of smaller scale examples of this, like for instance, the kind of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if you will, like in Greensboro, North Carolina, to address some killings that racially motivated killings that had occurred there. So there are models of of how to kind of bring out into the open the injustices that these categories have created in a manner that allows us to to move forward. But the kind of the temptation to bury it is I mean, it just often pops up in ways that are really damaging, of course, later, and I think the facing of it, and the kind of coming to a new hopefully consensus on a new narrative that's more inclusive is a way to move forward.
Hi. First a comment and then a question. First of all, I just really appreciate your presentation, and here maybe to add another thing that folks can do to resist. Just recently with the Starbucks incident there, you see the video picks up as the police are there. And the real culprit is the barista who called the police. And I'm wondering the whole time, why didn't that person with the camera phone go over to the barista and say, I'm sorry, why did you cause this event? That it was that person's fault. And in every one of these unarmed black person killings, there's always someone who calls the police, who unnamed, innocent, you never hear about it.
Right.
Without that agent, there is no violence.
Right.
And then a question. A few months ago, here in Kansas, there was a race conference put on by Mennonite Brethren, and there was the keynote speaker there was speaking about the event in Charlottesville, and he had said, kind of nonchalantly, well, the agitators that were there causing the violence were Muslims who were brought in on buses by Black Lives Matter activists. Okay, this was said in a conference, in a room full of pastors, and to me that was, if that wasn't insane enough, what really bothered me was no one countered that. No one said a thing, except for us later. But to the question of, I mean, can you confirm or deny that there were any Muslim buses brought in to start the Okay, I just want to know, because we were told officially that happened at a Mennonite Brethren conference.
Yeah, we have not received an invoice from the Muslim bus company for that expense.
Hi, I'm a middle school 8th grade American history teacher, and right now we are talking about slave narratives, because I don't start the Civil War until we talk about the people the Civil War was about. And I had to be gone on Friday, and they were reading slave narratives. It is incredibly hard to find quality material that I can use in my classroom that doesn't make me, because I'm not, we co-teach, because there's another teacher in the 8th grade, he's very textbook bound, and of course it's by dead white guys. And the narratives therein, and we talk about the Manifest Destiny narrative and how the Native Americans, and I had my students record on Flipgrid, I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, a minute 30 response to the question, how should we remember Jackson? And I stood back, and lo and behold, every one of my sorry, President Jackson. And every one of them was just floored about the refusal to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling. And, like, we should take statues down. And, this idea of how do we remember, because the way I'm supposed to teach the history, we put every one of those presidents on a pedestal and everything that they've done, and I have not gotten in trouble yet. But it is very uncomfortable sometimes to be in my faculty meetings and where my co-teacher is saying, so what have you taught? Because he's, like I said, he's very bound, and we get it out once a month maybe. So what suggestions do you have for those of us that are in the trenches? Because it all starts with us. The textbooks are horrible. The materials, and of course I said, well, why aren't there more narratives? And I said, well, people were illiterate. They were running for their lives. And they just so happened, we've talked about the Holocaust, and now we have a high percentage of Hispanic students in Newton who their story is very similar to some of the narratives that we're looking at. And we don't want to talk about that, or even the fact that Newton was very segregated. The public pool was not allowed for, it's because people just assume we live in the North. It must have been fine here. Or you lived in the South and you were pro-slavery. These ideas of the pockets therein, and how does Newton and North Newton encounter the privilege and the history that we have, because the little colonial houses and the Our Lady of Guadalupe are where the cement plant are. And it was paved over, it was taken out, and just that idea of honoring everyone's history. And it's really hard, because I kind of feel like I'm trudging on that path by myself sometimes.
No, that is really hard, talking about public school curricula like that, because this is where these narratives get passed along as just kind of common logic, and then it's become, it's part of the standard tests, that are given and all this sort of thing. I mean, one of the things that we're doing in Charlottesville now is that we asked and received from City Council an allocation for doing teacher professional development, around this issue. And there's a historian who does professional development for teachers of middle school and high school students. His name's Kevin Levin, and he runs cwmemory.org, Civil War Memory, and he's got a blog, and he's very active on Twitter and stuff. Anyway, he's going to come down and do a in-service day, for a day with our teachers to kind of retool them, and how to, to kind of try to bend them away from this kind of lost cause narrative of the Civil War and this sort of thing. But it's a lot of work. I mean, now in among professional historians, I mean, people like Jim, and this has been, for 40 years, this has been pretty much discarded. It's only now kind of fairly marginal folks who are professional historians that still kind of carry the flag for the lost cause interpretation. Oh, it was states' rights, about the Civil War. This is. But it's still so ingrained in, curricula still, and this sort of thing, and even textbooks and stuff, So it's really important to, to challenge that where you can. And I think, bringing in narratives, there are ways to do it, and there are people who are doing it, like Kevin Levin and many others, but I think bringing in narratives, it's the empathy thing that, that I talked about before, because that's what this category, white, because it's a not. Yeah, not black, not Indian, not Asian, not, yeah. that it truncates this, the version of humanity. So and it makes a very sclerotic sort of narrative. And so any way you can expand a narrative like that, and the empathy, because narrative brings us in. There's a story being told here. You know what I mean? So yeah, and the slave narratives, that's great. Using maybe the WPA, selectively some of the WPA interviews that were done, in the 1930s with formerly enslaved folks. It's great.
My name is Jan Swartzendruber, and this is my husband, Floyd Saunders. About 2016 is when we did Building Bridges, the art exhibit that brought Iraqi refugee art here to Bethel and into Wichita State. And since then, we've been continuing with other things that are to build bridges between white people and people of color. Because as it happens, most of the differences that we have to bridge do end up with those categories. So we've had a Muslim restaurant burned by arsonists in Wichita. We've had a Mexican-American restaurant burned by arsonists in Wichita. We've had a Muslim restaurant burned by arson in Wichita, and we've had a Mexican-American-owned restaurant burned by arsonists in Wichita. So I'm just saying, we live 30 minutes from the largest and most diverse city in Kansas, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King's new Poor People's Campaign, is here. It's in Wichita, it's in Topeka, it's in Manhattan, and Kansas City. I went to a training on Saturday, and I have contact information for you, only a few copies, and I may not be here if you want this, but let me just tell you, if you're interested in the Poor People's Campaign, it's nonviolent direct action is one option, but there are other ways to support that, and Mother's Day is the day when the nationwide activities in 40 states starts. So if you want the contact information, the simplest way to get in touch with them is this acronym. It's an email address, ppc.w. That's Poor People's Campaign.wichita@gmail.com. And if you do want to catch me, I can give you a handout here with the principles. But basically, it's racism, poverty, militarism, and we just sent missiles into Damascus, and environmental degradation that we're fighting. There will be training next Saturday afternoon in Wichita, and you can get more information.
Okay, we'll take, this will be our last question.
The pressure. Okay. I am sort of on the other side of the spectrum here. I'm a professor at one of the local colleges here, and I noticed in the photos of the martyrs, the people surrounding them that are causing violence on the protesters, and we know that they are older in these days if they are still with us. I am deeply troubled by the age and the statements I hear from some of the students that I see every day. And I think we would be really remiss to think that, which I've heard from a number of very well-meaning people saying, well, these ideas are dying out. They are from an older generation. And I am deeply concerned about the radicalization of our youth through social media and all kinds of other media venues. And I just wondered if you have any, cop watching is great, and a lot of these things are great ideas, but how do we fight that radicalization of our youth?
Come and listen to my talk tomorrow morning. That's when I'll be talking about that. Yeah. So I'll be talking about the alt-right, which is nothing new. The alt-right is just better clothes and better haircuts, but it's the same old warmed over white supremacy. Yeah, somewhat better haircuts. But yeah, there is, we have taken very concrete militant steps in Charlottesville to confront them. And our tactics, we contend, worked pretty well. I mean, we lost people. Your version of hell, yeah. But other communities have, taken what we've learned, and we've shared with other people, and they're doing their own things. And But there are ways that they need to be confronted, because what it was, for decades, considered, just, well, it was rightly considered, racist, saying some of these ideas and this sort of thing, and they certainly existed on the internet, places like 8chan, 4chan, Daily Stormer, etc. But during the 2016 presidential campaign, these folks came out and they said, hey, we're going to go IRL now. In real life, we're going to, they crawled out from under their rocks on the internet, basically, and took it to, so yeah, there are, I can send you a couple of articles that I wrote for a general audience about tactics of confronting the alt-right, but I'll be here again tomorrow if you want to, the rest of you want to come back and talk about what we did in Charlottesville to confront the alt-right.
That's right. So Dr. Schmidt will be convocation speaker tomorrow, and that will be at 11 a.m. back here in this auditorium. And her title is Holding Space in #Charlottesville, Confronting Alt-Right White Supremacists. So you will not want to miss that. If you are available, please come out. And to our people who can't be here, I do know these are recorded, and maybe we could try to sync up and figure out how you can get a copy of that. So thank you all. Let's give one more round of applause for Dr. Schmidt. Thank you, and have a great night.